The knife entered through the coat. It was quick. It was cowardly. It was in the back. It was night. It was Amsterdam. It was the year 1656. And the young man who had just left the synagogue felt the steel slide against his ribs as if darkness itself had decided to collect a debt he didn't even know he had incurred. He staggered. He brought his hand to the side of his body. He looked down, and when he saw the blood staining the dark fabric of his clothing, he did not scream. He did not call for help. He did not chase after the hooded man who was already disappearing among the narrow alleys of the Jewish quarter. He simply smiled. Because at that moment, at that very moment when his blood was flowing between the pale fingers of a philosopher just 23 years old, he understood something that would change the course of human thought forever. He understood that he was right, that the ideas he held in his head, those ideas he had yet to put on paper, those ideas he swore to himself he would still write no matter the cost, were so dangerous, so devastating, so capable of breaking the world, that men were willing to kill to prevent them from leaving his mouth. And if they wanted so much to kill him, it was because he was on the right path. That night, he stored the torn coat inside a trunk. He did not throw it away. He did not wash the blood. He did not hide the hole from the blade. He kept it. And for the rest of his life, whenever he sat down to write, he would pull that coat close, place it beside the table, and look at the dark tear in the fabric as one looks at a brother. That coat became his witness. That coat became his cross. That coat became the reminder that the world, when it discovers a truth too great, prefers to kill the messenger than to look in the mirror. His name was Baruch. But the world would come to know him, little by little, by another name. A whispered name, a cursed name, a name that rabbis spat, popes cursed, kings feared, and philosophers secretly copied to later pretend they had thought of it themselves. That name was Spinoza. And you, who are here now, may have heard of him only in a loose phrase, a quote from Einstein, a quick reference in a philosophy book. But I assure you, you do not know this man. No one knows this man, because everything you have been told about him has been filtered. Everything that remains of his story is what they managed not to erase. And what they managed to erase, my friend, what they managed to erase is exactly what I came to tell you today. I did not come here to give you a lesson. I did not come here to recite dates. I did not come here to repeat what any boring college book would tell you in 2 lukewarm pages. I came here to take you by the hand through one of the greatest silent crimes in the history of Western thought. A crime that began in a synagogue burning with hatred, that went through secret interrogations of the Portuguese Inquisition, that involved burned letters, banned books, spies sent by the Vatican, manuscripts stolen in the middle of the night, betrayals within the family itself, a sentence of excommunication so violent that it remains, to this day, 3.5 centuries later, the most brutal ever written against a single human being in the entire history of Judaism. And at the center of it all, alone, always alone, a thin man, sick with lung disease, with dark eyes and profound intelligence, polishing glass lenses in a rented room to avoid starving, while during the early hours of the morning he silently wrote the book that would, centuries later, make Einstein cry. Yes, Einstein cried upon reading Spinoza. Schopenhauer went mad trying to understand him. Nietzsche wrote in a letter, "I have a precursor, and what a precursor." Hegel said, "Either you are a Spinozist or you are not a philosopher," and yet almost no one knows who this man was. Almost no one understands what he really said. Almost no one realizes that we are living at this very moment in the world he predicted, and that he tried to warn us before it was too late. I need to ask you something before we begin. If you're in a hurry, close the video. Seriously, don't stay. Come back another day. Because what comes next is not disposable content. What comes next will require your time, your attention, and above all, your courage. Yes, courage. Because there are things in this story that will disturb you. There are things in this story that will challenge what you were taught since childhood. There are things in this story that, once heard, cannot be unheard. And that is why it has remained hidden for so long. But if you are still here, if you felt deep down that you need to hear this, that perhaps there is a reason you opened this video precisely today, precisely now, then take a deep breath with me. Because we are going to go back 370 years in time. We are going to enter a dark street in Amsterdam. We are going to open the door of a synagogue where 7 candles are lit, 7 torches are crackling, and a rabbi holding a scroll is about to pronounce the most terrible words of his life against a 23-year-old boy who dared to ask a question that no one can ask. This boy will not cry. This boy will not beg. This boy will simply look. And in that look will be contained the entire story I am about to tell you. The story of a man who carried an invisible cross through the streets of Europe while the whole world spat on the ground where he walked. The story of a man who was betrayed by his own, hunted by Christians, expelled by Jews, ignored by kings, and yet wrote the book that centuries later would change the way billions of people think about God, about freedom, about love, and about death. The story of the man who almost disappeared, but did not disappear, because I am here, and you are here, and from now on he will never disappear again. The story of this man does not begin in a synagogue. It begins much earlier. It begins in a port. In a port in Portugal in the middle of the night, at the end of the 16th century, when an entire family, parents, children, grandparents, uncles, silently boarded a small ship that would sail north to Holland, to Amsterdam, to the only place in the world where, at that time, Jews could be Jews without having to die for it. There were no shouts, there were no hugs, there were no farewells. There was only the sound of the muffled footsteps of sailors on the wet stones of the dock, and deep down, hidden under their clothes, against their chests, the tightened hearts of each of those men and women who knew deeply that if they were caught at that moment, all of them, without exception, would end the year in the dungeons of the Portuguese Inquisition. They were what was called Marranos, new Christians, disguised Jews. Families who, generations earlier, had been forced to convert to Catholicism under the penalty of death, but who continued in secret within their locked rooms, with the curtains drawn, lighting the Sabbath candles, whispering the prayers from the forbidden book, teaching their small children to never, under any circumstances, tell anyone, neither friends nor neighbors nor the school priest, that at home, after the sun went down, they were still Jews. The Spinozas were one of those families, and when the Inquisition began to approach dangerously close, when the denunciations started to arrive, when the interrogations became more frequent, when the neighbors stopped greeting them, they did the only thing that could still be done. They fled, they crossed the sea, and they disembarked, exhausted, starving, traumatized, in a place called Amsterdam. Amsterdam, in the 17th century, was not a city. It was a miracle. It was a city of geometrically designed canals, of narrow buildings painted in dark colors, of windmills turning against a gray sky, of merchants coming from all over the world, of sailors speaking 20 different languages at the same time, of boats arriving loaded with spices from the east and departing loaded with weapons for the colonies. It was a city where money circulated like blood, where knowledge circulated like air, and where, and this was the rarest of all miracles, Jews could finally, after centuries of persecution, live and breathe freely. The Jewish community of Amsterdam proudly called itself the Jerusalem of the North. They had their synagogue, they had their rabbis, they had their schools, they had their internal laws. They had, above all, one thing that had been stolen from them for entire generations. They had peace, a peace so precious, so hard won, that anyone who dared to put that peace at risk would pay dearly, very dearly. It was in this world that, in 1632, a boy was born. They named him Baruch. In Hebrew, it means blessed. It was a name chosen with care. He was the second child of the couple, the first man of the second generation, born in safety, far from the smell of torture, far from the fires of the Inquisition. It was a name of hope, a name of gratitude, a name of promise. But names sometimes do the opposite of what they promise. And that boy, that blessed boy, would live. Throughout his life, the least blessed life a Jewish man could have lived at that time. He would be cursed by the very community that loved him so much in his cradle. He would be expelled from the very temple that taught him so much. He would be hunted by the very people who protected him from the Inquisition. And in the end, he would die alone, without family, without close friends, without a rabbi, without any of his own by his side, in a rented room in a city where almost no one knew who he was. But we are not there yet. We have just arrived at the cradle. Baruch's father was named Miguel de Espinosa. He was a tall, thin, serious man, a merchant of dried fruits, an importer of olive oil and almonds from North Africa and Spain. He was also a respected member of the synagogue, president of committees, a donor of funds, a man of his word. He had achieved what few refugees of his generation managed. He had rebuilt his life from scratch, had enriched through hard work, and had placed his family, even if modestly, at the center of the new community. He was a man who carried on his back the weight of 2 generations of suffering, and at the same time the silent mission of not letting that suffering have been in vain. The mother, Hannah Deborah, was fragile. She coughed a lot. She knew she would not live long. And perhaps because of that, perhaps precisely because of that, she loved that middle child with an intensity that frightened. She held him in her arms for hours. She whispered to him in Ladino, the ancient language of Iberian Jews. She sang to him songs that had crossed the ocean within the memory of the family. And when he was just 6 years old, she died. Tuberculosis, weak lungs, the same disease that, decades later, would also kill the son. Some people say that was the moment that changed everything, that the boy changed there, that something closed inside those dark eyes at the moment he saw his mother's body being carried out of the house, wrapped in white cloth according to the Jewish ritual. Some people say that from that day on, Baruch began to observe the world with a certain distance, not cold, not bitter, but distant. Like someone who understands, before the time, that everything that exists will one day cease to exist. Like someone who understands that tying love to finite things is a silent way of hurting oneself every day. Maybe it's true, maybe not. What is known for sure is that at the age of 7, Baruch entered the Jewish school called Talmud Torah. It was the best religious school in the world at the time. It had been founded by Sephardim from Portugal and Spain and offered an extraordinary education. Hebrew, Aramaic, Torah, Talmud, medieval commentaries, logic, rhetoric, classical Jewish philosophy. Children entered at 7 and left at 17, ready to discuss theology on equal footing with any European rabbi. Baruch was, from the first year, the student who scared the teachers, not for rebellion, for intelligence. Contemporary accounts describe a quiet, thin boy with dark, curly hair, with large, deep eyes that seemed always to be looking a little beyond the interlocutor. He did not interrupt. He did not compete. He did not seek approval. But when, after an entire class listening in silence, he finally opened his mouth to ask a question, when he asked a question, silence fell over the entire room. Because his questions were not child's questions. They were questions that rabbis with 50 years of study would not know how to answer. At 10, he already knew the entire Torah by heart. At 12, he was already able to quote and comment on entire passages of the Talmud in Hebrew from beginning to end without consulting the text. At 14, he was already discussing philosophical interpretations of the prophets with men 30 years older than him. And at 15 was when he began to ask those questions. Those questions he did not yet understand were dangerous. Those questions that, later, he would never be able to stop asking. Those questions that would, over time, transform the blessed boy of the Jerusalem of the North into the most cursed man in the history of Jewish thought. "Rabbi," he said one afternoon, inside the study hall, under the attentive gaze of the great Rabbi Saul Levi Mortira, the greatest theologian of the community, "if God is eternal, infinite, and is everywhere, where, exactly, is he not?" The rabbi looked at him. He did not answer immediately. The other students stopped breathing, because within that seemingly simple question, a child's question perhaps, was hidden the first seed of an idea that, years later, would cause that same rabbi, standing before the altar, with the Torah scroll in his hands and a broken heart, to pronounce against his favorite student the most terrible curse ever written by a Jew against another Jew in the entire history of the people of Israel. And the boy, unaware, unsuspecting, simply looked back, in silence, waiting for the answer. But the answer would never come. The answer never came. And perhaps it was exactly this absence of an answer, this embarrassed silence of the most respected rabbi in Amsterdam in the face of a question asked by a 15-year-old boy, that planted deep in Baruch's chest the first terrifying certainty of his life. The men who had the answers did not have the answers. The men who claimed to speak in God's name did not know God. The men who taught the way of truth were, in fact, repeating in a firm voice words that other men before them had said without knowing what they were saying. And once that crack opened in that boy's soul, it never closed again. He continued attending school. He continued going to the synagogue. He continued fulfilling the prayers, the fasts, the rituals. On the outside, he was the perfect student. On the inside, he was already in another place. At 16, tragedy knocked on the family's door again. Isaac, his older brother, the firstborn, Miguel de Espinosa's pride, died unexpectedly. Another body wrapped in white cloth. Another silence inside the house. Another empty chair at the Sabbath table. Baruch now became the oldest man in the house after his father. And the family's hope, the secret hope that he would one day be the great rabbi of the community, the intellectual pride of the Jerusalem of the North, now rested entirely on his narrow shoulders. The weight was enormous, but the questions were greater. It was during this time that he began to do something that, at that time, was seen as almost indecent for a young Jew of his position. He began to seek books outside the community. He began to buy, in discreet second-hand bookstores in the city, Latin translations of Christian philosophers. He began to read in secret authors that his school would never have mentioned, and to be able to read Latin well, because Latin in the 17th century was the language of all science, of all philosophy, of all knowledge circulating among European countries. He needed to learn Latin, and to learn Latin, he needed a teacher. And the teacher he found was the most dangerous man he could have crossed paths with. His name was Franciscus van den Enden, Dutch, ex-Jesuit, ex-priest, ex-everything. He was a man in his 50s, thin, intense, with bright eyes, owner of a small Latin school in the center of Amsterdam. By day, he taught rich children to decline Roman nouns. By night, in his back office, he welcomed a select group of young students for secret discussions about philosophy, politics, science, and, yes, religion. Van den Enden was a free thinker. He was radical. He was considered by the Catholic Church a near heretic. And it was in this man, this very man, that Baruch Spinoza, at 18 or 19 years old, found the teacher he had sought his entire life without knowing. It was van den Enden who introduced him to Descartes. Descartes, the Frenchman, the man who, a few decades earlier, had published a small, concise book that had shaken Europe. The Discourse on the Method. A book where he proposed an absurd thing, an almost blasphemous thing, something no one had dared to say so clearly before, that if we want to reach the truth, we must, above all, doubt. Doubt everything. Doubt our own senses. Doubt our own memories. Doubt our own teachers. Doubt even, if necessary, the truths that religion has taught us since the cradle. Baruch read that, and the ground of his life trembled. Because that was exactly what he had been trying to do in silence, hiding from everyone, since that day he asked the rabbi where God was not. That had a name, that was a method, that was philosophy. And once he discovered philosophy, he could never go back. Then began the nighttime meetings. Baruch would leave home in silence, cross the Jewish quarter, walk along streets paved with uneven stones, pass by canals reflecting the yellowed lights of other people's windows, and arrive at van den Enden's school. Inside, around a table with open books, flickering candles, whispering voices, he found other young people, some Jews like him, others Dutch, others exiled French, all thirsty for the same questions he carried. And there, in that back room, in a silent circle of dim light, they discussed everything. They discussed God. They discussed the soul. They discussed freedom. They discussed whether the Bible was literally true or just a set of human stories. They discussed whether miracles were miracles or just natural phenomena that the ancients could not explain. They discussed what no one outside those walls could discuss, and Baruch, in all the discussions, was the quietest and the deepest. The others spoke loudly. He thought slowly. The others quoted. He built. The others showed off. He understood. It was during this period, too, that something else happened. Something that is little talked about, but that perhaps weighed on his heart as much as any philosophical idea. Van den Enden had a daughter. Her name was Clara Maria. She was young, she was intelligent, she spoke Latin, she spoke Greek, she played music, and she also taught. Yes, she helped her father in class. And accounts from the time whisper, without ever confirming for sure, that Baruch fell in love. He fell in love silently, as he fell in love with everything, inwardly, without showing it, hiding even from himself. And that Clara, although she liked him, although she admired him, ended up choosing another student, a wealthier, more handsome, more conventional young man. And that Baruch never spoke of it to anyone. He never wrote a line about it. He never complained. He simply kept, in some quiet corner of his memory, yet another of the small losses that would accumulate, one on top of the other, throughout his solitary life. You who are here, listening to this story, I need to pause for a moment. I need to ask you something. Look, I know there are thousands of videos you could watch right now. There are fun things, there are quick things, there are easy things. But you chose to stay here with me, listening to the story of a man who lived almost 400 years ago. That to me is no small thing. That to me means you are not just any person. It means that inside you there is something that is still searching, that still wants to understand, that is still not satisfied with the ready-made answers the world serves every day on a plate. And that is why, it is exactly for that reason, that I need to ask you now, before we continue, what do you think this 19-year-old boy asked his Latin teacher one of those nights around the table by candlelight, that made that older man, that ex-priest, that radical, that one who had seen it all, fall silent, lower his eyes and say after a long breath, "Son." There are questions that, once asked, change the fate of those who ask them. Write it down below in the comments. Write it now without thinking too much. What do you think this boy asked? What do you think was so heavy that even the teacher trembled? I will read it. I swear I will read it. And while you think about that, let me tell you something from the heart. Stories like this, told this way, take days to prepare. Whole days reading, researching, rewriting, trying to find the right tone so that you feel, truly feel, the weight of each word. And what sustains this work here, what allows this channel to continue existing, is one single thing: your support. So, if you are enjoying it, if you feel that this video deserves it, do something simple. Do it now, without needing to stop listening. Hit that little red subscribe button. It's just a click, but for me, it's everything. Because with each new subscriber, more stories like this can be born. More forgotten men can come back to life. More silently carried crosses can finally be seen. You are part of it now. You are part of this journey. Now take a deep breath, because we are going back to Amsterdam. We are going back to that table, those candles, that circle of young people thirsty for answers, and we will discover what happened that night when Baruch, after many months of reading, after many months of silence, finally decided to ask the only question he had kept inside him since he was 15, the question he had never had the courage to ask the rabbi, the question he now dared to ask Van den Enden, the question that the old professor looked at him lingeringly before answering, "Son, if you go to the end of this, they will kill you." Baruch smiled, discreetly, for the first time in many years, and he answered in a low but firm voice, "Then let them kill me. I can no longer not ask." And it was at that moment, at that very moment, that the philosopher was born, and that the boy definitively died. The boy's death, of course, was not violent. It was silent, it was gradual. It was made up of small daily deaths, each time Baruch left the synagogue feeling inside that everything that had been said had not touched his soul. Each time he sat at the table with his family and heard his father recite the blessings in the voice of one who repeats without feeling anymore. Each time he looked at his classmates from the Talmud Torah and realized that they had already stopped asking questions, that they were already content with the answers, that they had already settled into that comfortable box called inherited faith. Baruch could not settle. And while, on the outside, he fulfilled the rituals, putting on the talit, reciting the Shema, observing the Sabbath, fasting on Yom Kippur, inside, in silence, he was conducting the most dangerous investigation that a Jew of that time could conduct against himself. He was investigating his own faith. He was opening the hood. He was looking inside the engine. He was asking, how does this work? Why does this work? Does it really work? Or does it just seem to work because no one has looked closely yet? And the more he looked, the stranger things he saw. He saw, for example, that the Bible had contradictions, small ones, subtle ones, things that, if a distracted reader skimmed over, would not notice. But Baruch was not a distracted reader. Baruch was the boy who knew the entire text by heart. And when he realized that two passages, theoretically written by the same author, said opposite things, he could not pretend he hadn't seen it. When he realized that Moses, supposedly the author of the first 5 books of the Torah, calmly narrated his own death and burial at the end of Deuteronomy, something logically impossible for an author who was still alive writing, he could not pretend he hadn't noticed. When he realized that there were different literary styles throughout the same book, different vocabularies, historical contradictions with known facts, miracles described in conflicting ways in different chapters, he could not continue to say aloud in the synagogue, along with everyone else, "This is the perfect book, dictated by God, word for word, without error," because he had seen, he had read, he had counted, And the problem is that once you see something like that, you cannot unsee it. It was around this time, at about 20 years old, that Baruch began to develop a theory that centuries later would become an entire discipline called biblical criticism. He began to argue, first with himself, then with Van den Enden, and later with a few selected friends, that the Bible was not a book written by God. It was a book written by men, by many men, over many generations. It was a compilation, a stitching together, a deeply human work, with all that is great and flawed about humanity. It was a precious book, yes, important, yes, but it was not the literal word of a God who had come down from heaven dictating comma by comma to a man named Moses on a mountain called Sinai. Today, in the 21st century, this may seem obvious, almost boring. We have grown up hearing these things. We have seen documentaries about it. We have read books that openly discuss these issues. But in 1652 in Amsterdam, within a Jewish community that had just escaped the fires of the Inquisition, that had just rebuilt its religious identity, that had just signed a silent agreement of total obedience to the scriptures and to the rabbis in exchange for peace and stability, in 1652 in Amsterdam, saying that was like throwing a bomb into a closed room. It was self-destruction, and more. It was killing the peace of the entire community. Because if a single Jew from a respected family began to publicly argue that the Bible was not the Word of God, it would give immediate ammunition to Christian critics. It would give an excuse for Calvinist preachers, who were already complaining about the freedom that Jews had in Amsterdam, to demand from the Dutch authorities that that freedom be revised. It would provide the perfect pretext for everything that the community had achieved over decades: the synagogue, the schools, the right to trade, peace, to be put at risk. Because of a single boy who could not stop asking questions. The rabbis knew this, and they began to worry. The first to notice within the house was the sister, Rebecca, older, married, a mother. She had always envied her brother. She was intelligent, yes, but in a community that valued the study of men, she had been relegated to learning just enough to manage the household. While Baruch read the Talmud at 12, she took care of the younger siblings. While Baruch discussed theology with rabbis, she sewed by candlelight, and she carried in silence a thin, ancient anger against that brilliant brother who seemed to receive everything from life without effort. When their father, Miguel, fell ill, and the illness was quick, it was cruel, Rebecca began to see an opportunity. If Miguel died, all the family assets would pass to Baruch, according to Jewish law and Dutch commercial law. And she, Rebecca, even being the eldest, would receive practically nothing. That ate away at her. Miguel died in 1654. Baruch was 22 years old, and while others mourned the loss of the father, the respected merchant, the pillar of the family, Rebecca was already scheming how to take from her brother everything she thought was rightfully hers. She hired lawyers. She filed a lawsuit claiming that Baruch, being a man and younger, should not inherit alone, that she, as the eldest daughter, had the right to half or more. She dragged her brother into the Dutch courts, and Baruch, this is one of the first clear signs in the historical record of who he was, did something extraordinary. He fought the case to the end. He proved with documents, with witnesses, with laws, that the inheritance was entirely his. He won. The court ruled in his favor on all points. And then, at the moment when the judge struck the gavel and said, "All of this belongs to you, Baruch Spinoza, and Mrs. Rebecca has no right to anything," Baruch turned to his sister, looked her in the eyes, and said, "Everything that the court decided is mine, I give to you. Keep it all. Just leave me my father's bed with the blanket. That's all I want." And he left the room. Rebecca stood there, not knowing what to say, not knowing whether to thank or cry or feel ashamed. The lawyers were stunned. The judge was stunned. No one in all of Amsterdam had seen anything like that. A man who fights for years for an inheritance, wins the case, and then gives everything away for free to the party that had tried to rob him. Why? The answer, and this answer is one of the first keys to understanding who Baruch Spinoza was, is painfully simple. He had fought the case not for the money. He had fought for the truth. He had fought so that no one, neither his sister nor the court nor the community, could ever say that he had been unjust or that he had yielded out of laziness. But once the truth was recognized, once the judge said, "You are right," the money ceased to matter, because the money had never mattered. He wanted the truth, and he had already achieved that. The rest was dust. It was at that moment, perhaps, that many in the community began to realize that this young man was not an ordinary man. And what kind of thought must be inside that head for a man to behave in such a strange way, so completely outside the standards of any reasonable person of that time? And it was around this same period that the first heavy rumors about Baruch Spinoza began to circulate, rumors that came from the corners of the synagogue, rumors that reached the ears of the rabbis, rumors that said that this young man, the favorite student of Mortera, the pride of Miguel de Spinoza, was, in secret, attending the homes of free-thinking Christians. He was reading forbidden books. He was saying absurd things about the Torah. He was denying the immortality of the soul. He was denying the existence of angels. He was denying, and this was the worst of all, that God had any form of personality, will, or choice. That God was not a father, was not a judge, was not a king in the heavens. That God was something else, something so different, so strange, so radical, that no rabbi of that synagogue could even begin to comprehend. And when these rumors reached the ears of the council of the synagogue, the Ma'amad, an urgent meeting was called, 7 men, a table, a closed room, and a single decision to make. Was there still a way to save that boy, or was it already too late? The room where the Ma'amad met was at the back of the synagogue, separated from the prayer hall by a double door of dark oak. It was a small, austere room without ornaments. A rectangular table occupied the center. Carved wooden chairs were lined up around it. On the walls, silver candelabra held white wax candles, and in the corner, in a small niche, there was a closed, silent copy of the Torah, observing like a mute witness everything that was decided there. It was in that room, at the beginning of the year 1656, that 7 men sat in silence. They were the elders of the community, wealthy merchants, traditional donors, defenders of stability, and among them at the head of the table was the man who had been Baruch's teacher since he was 7 years old, the chief rabbi of the community, the most respected theologian, the author of erudite treatises, the beloved pastor of hundreds of families, Rabbi Saul Levi Mortera. Mortera was suffering. Contemporary accounts describe a visibly shaken man in the weeks leading up to that meeting. He had lost weight. He had deep circles under his eyes. He had been seen more than once sitting alone in the empty synagogue at night, with his hands over his face. Because what was about to happen was, for him, worse than burying a child. It was worse than losing a friend. It was seeing with his own eyes the best student he had ever had in 40 years of teaching, that brilliant boy he had seen grow up, whom he had hoped to prepare to be one day his successor, walk voluntarily with open eyes toward the precipice, and realizing that there was no longer anything he could do to stop it. He had tried everything. He had called Baruch privately to his office dozens of times over that year. He had sat with him. He had argued. He had opened the texts. He had shown the medieval commentaries. He had quoted Maimonides. He had quoted the prophets. He had reminded Baruch of everything the community had sacrificed to get to this point, of everything his family, the Spinoza family, had suffered so that he could study in peace within that synagogue today. He had pleaded without pleading, with the wounded dignity of an old master speaking to his most beloved disciple. Baruch, my son, I know what you are thinking. I know what you are reading. I know about the conversations with that Dutchman, and I ask you, in the name of your father, may God rest him, to keep this, not forever, but for now. Wait, mature, study more. The questions you are asking are big questions, true questions, I know, but the community is not ready. The world is not ready. And if you speak now, they will destroy you. Do you understand? They will destroy you. And Baruch, and this is one of the most moving parts of the entire story, because it shows the torn heart of that young man. Baruch listened in silence. He did not argue. He did not retort. He simply looked at the old master he had loved so much and replied, with a voice deeper than he usually had, more tired, older than his 23 years, "Rabbi, I would give my life for you. I would give my name, my blood, my inheritance, everything. But the only thing I cannot give is my truth, because if I gave my truth, if I lied with my mouth to what my mind can no longer believe, I would not be saving the community. I would be poisoning it from within. I would be the worst of hypocrites. And I think, Rabbi, that you know this better than I do." Mortera lowered his eyes. He could not retort, because the student was right, and because the master deep down knew that he had been the one, during all those years of lessons, who had taught Baruch to place the truth above all else. The last attempt was the most humiliating. It was when the Ma'amad itself officially offered Baruch a pension, a generous sum, a lifetime salary, in exchange for a single thing: that he continue attending the synagogue, that he participate in the festivities, that he say nothing more in public about his doubts, that he, in other words, sell his silence in exchange for comfort. Contemporary accounts, and particularly an account written many years later by a man named Lucas, Baruch's biographer, describe the scene with painful precision. Baruch was standing before the Ma'amad. He wore dark, simple clothes. His hair was a bit long over his shoulders, his eyes calm, and when the representative of the council finished the proposal, a long proposal, full of circumlocutions, full of good intentions, full of disguised pressures, Baruch responded with a single sentence: "Gentlemen, I do not sell what does not belong to me. The truth is not mine to sell. I am merely its servant." And he left the room. It was at that moment, some say, that the Ma'amad understood that there was no way out anymore. The final meeting took place in July 1656. The 7 men sat down. Mortera presided. In front of him on the table was a blank parchment. Next to the parchment, a quill. And around the quill, the heaviest silence that room had ever known. One of the elders began to speak. He spoke about the rumors. He spoke about the formal accusations. At least 2 people, 2 young men from the community itself, had presented themselves to the Ma'amad in writing, with names and signatures, stating that Baruch, in private conversations, had said things like that the soul was not immortal, that God had no will or understanding like humans, that the Bible was not literally true, that angels did not exist. They had said more. They had said that he had laughed when someone mentioned a miracle of the prophets, that he had said that was a children's tale. When the elder finished reading the accusations, Mortera remained silent for a long time. The others waited. No one dared to speak. Finally, the old rabbi raised his head. His eyes were red. His voice choked. "You know how I feel about this boy?" he began. "You know what he represents to me. But the community cannot be destroyed because of a single man, no matter how brilliant he is. If he continues saying what he is saying and we do nothing, in a few months All the young people of the Talmud Torah will be saying the same things. And in a few years, there will be no more community. The Calvinists will use this against us. The Dutch authorities will restrict our freedoms. Everything we have achieved, everything our parents have achieved with so much blood, will be lost because of a single mouth that could not remain silent. He paused, swallowed hard, and then with a trembling hand he took the quill, dipped it in the ink, and began to write on the blank parchment the words that for the next 350 years would be discussed, cited, translated, condemned, and cursed as the most violent religious document ever written against a single human being in the entire modern history of Judaism. It was a document known as Herem, the greater excommunication. It was reserved for the worst cases. It was used rarely. It was, in essence, the civil death sentence of a Jew. From then on, he would cease to exist. No one could speak to him anymore. No one could eat with him anymore. No one could read anything written by him. No one could approach him within 4 cubits. Not family, not friends, not neighbors. He would be, for all intents and purposes, a dead man walking among the living. Mortera wrote for over an hour. The other 6 people in the room did not speak a word. When he finished, he held the parchment up to the light of the candles. He reread it in silence, and then, with a voice that no longer seemed to be his, he announced, "The ceremony will be on the 27th of this month. May God have mercy on us, and on him." That same night, and this is recorded in a surviving letter from a member of the Ma'amad, Baruch was walking through the narrow streets of the Jewish quarter, returning from Vanden Enden's house where he had dined, when he felt a movement behind him. It was quick. It was cowardly. It was from behind. A blade slid against his coat, and although the knife did not go deep enough to kill him, although he managed to turn, escape, run, something inside him understood, at that exact moment, under the fine rain of that Amsterdam night, that the time for negotiations had ended, that the time for warnings had ended, that a different phase of his life had now begun, a phase in which he would have to choose, every day, every hour, whether the truth he had found within himself was worth more than his own skin. He arrived home, locked the door, took off his coat, looked at the tear, and smiled. The same smile of someone who finally understands that he is alone, and that this solitude is the price and the glory of being the man he decided to be. July 27th, 1656, dawned grey. The chroniclers who later reconstructed that day described the sky of Amsterdam as heavy, low, one of those that seemed to rest on the rooftops of houses as if they wanted to enter them. The canals reflected that dull, lifeless light, without shine, without mirror. The seagulls, which usually made noise in the morning over the masts of the ships anchored in the harbour, fell silent early that day, and through the Jewish quarter, through the narrow streets surrounding the Esnoga, the great Portuguese synagogue, passed an unusual silence. A full silence, a silence felt when everyone inside knows that something grave is about to happen. No one needed to be warned. The news had circulated through the community for 2 days already, from house to house, from door to door, in whispers. That afternoon, after the morning service, after the common prayers, the Ma'amad would pronounce the Herem against Baruch Spinoza, against the young man whom many had seen grow up, against the favorite student of Rabbi Mortera, against the son of the late Miguel, may God rest him, against one of their own, against the boy whom so many mothers in the community had dreamed of seeing married to their own daughters for years. Some of those mothers cried that morning, in silence, washing dishes, sewing by the window, looking at the grey sky and not understanding why their hearts felt so heavy. The synagogue began to fill up shortly before 3 in the afternoon. The men entered through the side doors, covered by their talits, the prayer shawls, with their heads down, not greeting each other as they usually did. The dark wooden benches, with high backs, were occupied in silence. The women, according to the custom of the time, went up to the upper floor, behind the finely carved wooden lattice, and from there observed everything without being seen. Children were left at home. It was a day when children were not brought. In the center of the synagogue, on the bima, the elevated platform where the Torah was read, Rabbi Mortera took his place. He wore black. Over the black, the talit. Over the talit, an expression that no one in that community had ever seen on his face before. It was not anger. It was not sadness. It was something akin to the look of a father who is about to bury his own child, but with his own hands. Next to him, on a small table, was a rolled-up parchment. It was tied with a black ribbon. No one needed to ask what that parchment contained. 7 candles had been lit. It was the ritual number required by the procedure. It was not the first time that community had pronounced a herem. There had been other cases before, against other young men who had strayed. But in all other cases, before the herem was read, there had been a final chance for repentance. The accused was called. He was invited to retract, to ask for forgiveness, to publicly reconcile with the community. On that day, however, no one expected Baruch to come, and Baruch did not come. He did not appear. He did not ask to be heard. He did not write a letter of defense. He did not send an intermediary. That very morning, according to testimonies that circulated years later, he had woken up, dressed as he would on any other day, and had walked alone, in the opposite direction of the synagogue, toward Van den Enden's office, where he would spend the afternoon reading, in silence, a copy of Descartes' works that had recently been lent to him. He asked to be left alone. He said he needed to work. He said he would return at night. Accounts from that time describe that throughout the afternoon he did not lift his eyes from the book. Not once. Not even when, on the other side of the city, at the exact scheduled moment, his life was being formally dissolved. At 3 o'clock sharp, Rabbi Mortera stood up. The entire synagogue rose. He unrolled the parchment and began to read. The language of the herem was in Portuguese, because the Sephardic community of Amsterdam still predominantly used the language of their Iberian ancestors. And the tone was escalated, rhetorical, carefully constructed to produce maximum emotional impact. It began with a traditional formula, recalling Baruch's sin, his horrible heresies, his monstrous actions. And then, slowly, word by word, it entered into what was the heart of the curse, the imprecations. I will read to you here, in updated Portuguese, excerpts of what was pronounced that day. I ask you to pay attention, because these words, these exact words, are perhaps the most violent words a human being has ever pronounced against another human being in the entire modern history of Judaism. And they were pronounced, remember, by men who loved Baruch, by men who had seen him grow up, by men who suffered to say each word, which makes everything even more terrifying. By the sentence of the angels and by the word of the saints, we excommunicate, expel, curse, and execrate Baruch Spinoza, with the consent of God, blessed be he, and with the consent of this entire sacred community, before these holy scrolls of the Torah, with their 613 precepts. Cursed be he by day, and cursed be he by night. Cursed be he when he lies down, and cursed be he when he rises. Cursed be he when he goes out, and cursed be he when he enters. God will not forgive him, and the wrath and zeal of the Lord will burn against this man, and will bring upon him all the curses that are written in this book of the law. And God will erase his name from under the heavens, and will separate him for his evil from all the tribes of Israel. Pause. The synagogue in silence. And then Mortera continued, We warned that no one should maintain oral or written communication with him. No one should render him any favor. No one should be under the same roof with him. No one should approach him within a distance of less than 4 cubits, and no one should read any text written by him or drafted by him. And it was at that moment, according to later accounts, that some of the women behind the lattice began to cry softly. Not because of the severity of the curse, which was standard, but because of the last clause, the clause that said, "No one may read any text written by him." Because there, at that moment, the community realized that the Mahmad already knew, had already understood, had already foreseen, that that boy, that brilliant young man of 23 years would write a lot, would write things that could, yes, shake the world. And that, for that very reason, it was necessary to close all doors, all windows, all paths through which those words could enter back into the community. The parchment was rolled up. The black ribbon was tied. The 7 candles were extinguished, one by one, slowly, in the reverse order of how they had been lit. And when the last candle went out, the harem was complete. Baruch Spinoza, son of Miguel, grandson of Isaac, of the house of the Spinoza of Vidigueira in Portugal, ceased to exist. For the community, for the synagogue, for the Jewish people, for God, because that is how the formula declared, he was from then on a dead man, a name crossed out, a torn page, an empty chair that would never be occupied again, the synagogue emptied in silence. Some people, upon leaving, looked toward the Spinoza house across the canal, as if expecting to see, in the window, the cursed young man watching from afar his own condemnation. But there was no one. The windows were closed, the curtains dark. It was only at dusk, when Baruch finally left Van den Enden's office and walked back to his home, or to what had been his home until that afternoon, that he received at the door a note left by a servant of the community. It was sealed. It had no sender's name. He opened it on the threshold of the door. Read in silence. It was the official copy of the harem, and underneath, handwritten in a script he immediately recognized as belonging to Rabbi Mortera himself, there was a single additional phrase outside the document. A personal phrase, a phrase that perhaps was, and historians debate this to this day, a last desperate attempt to say something that even the entire harem had not managed to convey. It simply said, "May the God you now say you do not know still protect you." Baruch folded the paper. He did not cry. He did not tremble. He simply tucked the note into the inner pocket of his coat, the same coat that had been torn by the knife and which he now carried like a second skin. He entered the house, sat at the table where for 23 years he had taken all the meals of his life, looked at the empty chair of his father, looked at the empty chair that had been his mother's, and before her, his brother's, looked at all the empty chairs in that house that, within a few days, he would have to abandon forever. And for the first time, in a long time, he understood, truly understood with his whole body, what it meant to be alone. And he also understood that this was only the beginning. There are solitudes that we choose, and there are solitudes that choose us. Baruch Spinoza's was both at the same time. He had chosen, yes, to say what he had said. He had chosen to think what he had thought. He had chosen not to retreat when retreating was still possible. But the way the world responded, the way each door of his previous life closed one by one, at the same time, on the same day, with the same dry and definitive sound, that was not his choice. That was imposed. And it is a very different thing, from the point of view of the human soul, to choose to walk alone, and to be left alone by force without warning, in the middle of the road, not knowing where to go. In the first days after the harem, he stayed at his father's house. He had a legal right to stay. The house was his. The belongings were his. But it was impossible. The neighbors walked down the street with their heads down, avoiding looking at the windows. The former classmates from the Talmud Torah, if they crossed paths with him by accident in the narrow streets of the neighborhood, would cross to the other side, pretending not to have seen him. The merchants where he used to buy fruits and bread apologized without looking him in the eye, saying they could no longer serve him. His sister, Rebecca, the same one to whom he had generously given all the inheritance a few months before, had been the first to cut contact. She did not respond to letters. She did not answer the door. She had, according to witnesses, sent her small children to spit on the ground if they heard their uncle's name. The house, with all its memories, had turned into a silent prison. It was at that moment that Baruch made the decision that would define the rest of his life. He would leave. He would leave Amsterdam. He would leave the Jewish neighborhood. He would leave everything. And more, he would take nothing. No furniture, no jewelry, no fortune. He would sell everything. He would donate a good part, and he would carry only 3 things: enough clothes to survive, some essential books, and his father's bed, the same bed with the blanket that he had reserved for himself in the lawsuit against his sister. It was, symbolically, the only thing from the past that he wanted to keep. It was the last concrete bond with Miguel de Spinoza, the man who had fathered and raised him, and who, if he were still alive, might, just might, have managed to prevent all of this. And there was one more decision, perhaps the most symbolic of all. He would change his name. Baruch, the blessed in Hebrew, would start signing as Bento, in Portuguese, the family's mother tongue. Later, when he began to publish in Latin, he would sign Benedictus. The 3 words mean exactly the same thing. But by changing his name, he made a silent declaration. He was no longer the Baruch of the Esnoga. He was no longer the son of the Ma'amad. He was a new man, a man without community, without institutional religion, without label, a man who answered only to his own conscience and nothing more. Thus, in the autumn of 1656, at just 24 years old, Bento de Spinoza crossed for the last time the gates of the Jewish neighborhood of Amsterdam, with a small trunk and a disassembled bed tied to a borrowed handcart, and disappeared onto the paved roads that cut through the low fields of Holland towards a small village nearby called Rijnsburg. Why Rijnsburg? Because it was there that at that time one of the strangest and most fascinating communities of 17th century Europe lived, the collegians. They were not exactly a sect, they were not exactly a church, they had no priests, no formal sacraments, no mandatory dogmas. They were a group of deeply free-thinking Christians who gathered every Sunday in a simple house, without altar, without pulpit, sitting in a circle. And there, in silence, anyone, man or woman, could stand up and speak what they believed to be true, what they had reflected on the scriptures, what they had learned in dreams or in prayer. It was the most radical thing in religious matters that existed in that Europe. It was a community without a master, where each one was responsible for their own truth, where no one was obliged to believe in anything, and where no one could be excluded for what they thought. For Bento, it was the perfect opposite of the synagogue that had just expelled him, and it was among these collegians, among these simple people, mostly poor, mostly uneducated, but mostly absolutely thirsty for truth, that he found, for the first time after the Herem, something resembling a home. Not a home like the previous one, not a home of blood, but a home of spirit. People who treated him naturally, who asked about his studies, who read with him the books he read, who were not afraid to disagree with him, nor were offended when he disagreed with them, who laughed with him, ate with him, cried with him. It was among the collegians that Bento discovered that, despite everything that had happened, he was still capable of affection. And that affection, when it does not come tied to religious rules and community obligations, is a rare and sweet thing, something he had never experienced before. But affection does not pay bills, and Bento now needed to work. The inheritance he had received from his father had been almost entirely given to his sister. The small savings he had managed to set aside did not last long, and he had one certainty: he would never depend on a pension. He would never accept money in exchange for silence, in exchange for loyalty, in exchange for patronage. He wanted absolute freedom. And to have absolute freedom, he needed a job that could be done at home in silence for a few hours a day, leaving him plenty of time to think, read, and write. He chose then perhaps the most symbolically perfect job that a philosopher has ever chosen in history. He became a lens polisher. Yes, lenses, glass lenses, for glasses, for telescopes, for microscopes. It was the 17th century. It was the height of the scientific revolution. It was the time when men like Galileo looked for the first time through telescopes to see the moons of Jupiter. It was the time when other men, like Antony van Leeuwenhoek, managed to see for the first time invisible microorganisms through increasingly sophisticated microscopes. For these instruments to work, one thing was needed: very, very well-polished lenses, perfect glass, mathematically exact curvatures. It was a demanding artisanal job that required steady hands, infinite patience, and a certain degree of mathematical knowledge. Bento learned. He learned quickly, and soon he became one of the best lens polishers in Holland. His lenses became famous. Important scientists ordered from him. Universities began to use his lenses in research laboratories. Even the Royal Society of London, founded shortly thereafter, would mention in internal correspondence the extraordinary quality of the lenses of the philosopher of Voorburg, because later Bento would move from Rijnsburg to Voorburg, and then to The Hague. And this is one of the most moving images in the entire history of Western philosophy. Imagine now, this man, imagine a small room on the upper floor of a simple house, rented for a few florins a month. The white walls, unadorned, a window overlooking a quiet street, a small table in the corner with an inkwell, quills, papers in organized piles, a narrow bed covered with his father's old blanket, and in the center of the room a workbench. On the bench, fine tools, manual lathes, sandpapers, abrasive powders, glass spheres in different stages of finishing. And beside the bench, sitting on a wooden stool with a grey apron over dark clothes, with long hair tied back, with eyes focused on a small piece of glass that he slowly turned between his fingers, is Bento de Spinoza, the philosopher who had been cursed by his community, and who now, every day, from 9 in the morning to 2 in the afternoon, polished lenses with the care of someone who knows that each well-made lens is 1 millimeter more of vision for humanity. In the afternoon, he studied. At night, he wrote. And it was in that room, in that exact simple room, without expensive books, without an extensive library, without secretaries, without assistants, that he began to draft, in silence, in impeccable Latin, the texts that would, centuries later, forever transform Western philosophy. He started with small experimental treatises. Then he moved on to bolder texts: the treatise on the reform of the understanding, the brief treatise on God, man, and his well-being. And in parallel, with absolute calm, without any rush, he began to outline what would be the great project of his life, the book he would never publish in his lifetime, the book he would revise for more than 10 years, the book that would simply be called Ethica, and which many today consider without hesitation one of the absolute masterpieces of human thought of all time. But all of this, at that moment, was still a silent whisper. The fine dust of glass settled on the shoulders of the apron. And outside, in Europe, the world continued unaware that in a lost little room of a Dutch village, A cursed man polished lenses during the day and shaped at night with the same millimetric precision the ideas that would change the course of Western thought forever. The following years were, seen from the outside, years of poverty. Seen from the inside, they were the richest years of Baruch Spinoza's life. He lived with little, really little. The notes that survived from the house where he lived in Voorburg, after he moved from Rijnsburg in 1663, show that his monthly expenses barely covered the rent of the room: daily bread, milk, some vegetables, and occasionally a bit of cheese. Meat, almost never. Wine, almost never. New clothes, almost never. He repaired his own clothes, patched his own shoes, and wore the same dark coat year after year after year. Always the same coat, always carefully brushed, always with the old tear on the inner side, sewn on the inside but never hidden on the outside, because he wanted it to be there, always there, as a silent reminder. Those who visited him at that time described the strange feeling of entering that room. It was not a sad room. It was not a miserable room. It was a quiet, orderly, clean room where a kind of deep, almost palpable peace reigned. The books were carefully stacked. The lenses in different stages of polishing rested on shelves, organized by curvature. The papers on the table were separated by theme, by day, by line of reasoning. And in the midst of all this, sitting on a simple stool, with long, dark hair falling over his collar, with skin pale from little contact with the sun, with fingers stained by the fine dust of glass, was the philosopher, working, thinking, receiving the visitor with a discreet smile and a low voice that, according to all who knew him, never rose in anger, impatience, or despair at any moment in his adult life. Henry Oldenburg, founding secretary of the Royal Society of London, was one of those visitors. He had heard of that strange philosopher who polished lenses and wrote in Latin, and in 1661 crossed the English Channel just to meet him. Years later, in letters, Oldenburg would confess that he left that meeting transformed. "I found," he wrote, "a man whose intelligence left me silent for hours, but whose human simplicity left me silent for a lifetime." From that meeting, Bento and Oldenburg would begin an intense correspondence that would last for years. It was through these letters that many of the philosopher's ideas would begin to circulate, secretly, among the scientific circles of England. It was through these letters that he came into contact with the thought of Robert Boyle, with the experiments of the Royal Society, with the latest discoveries in optics, in astronomy, in chemistry. It was also through these letters that Oldenburg, carefully, with affection, but with the clarity of someone who truly admired him, insisted, "Publish, my friend, publish. The world needs to read what you are writing." And Bento smiled, and postponed, because he knew that publishing was a risk. Not an abstract risk. It was a concrete, physical, mortal risk. Holland was, yes, the most tolerant place in Europe at that time, but even in Holland there were limits. Limits set by the Reformed Church, which dominated the Protestant religious landscape. Limits set by civil authorities who tolerated dissent up to a point, but reacted with fury when that dissent threatened public order. And Bento knew, with the cold clarity that was his hallmark, that what he was writing would go far beyond any tolerated limit. He was silently preparing two simultaneous blows, one blow to the traditional conception of God and one blow to the political authority of churches over the state. It was explosive theology. It was explosive politics. Together they were pure dynamite. In 1665, he decided to temporarily interrupt the writing of the Ethics, which was already quite advanced, to write another book, more urgent, more immediate, more combative. This book would be called the Theological Political Treatise. It would be a book of combat, a book intended to publicly defend freedom of thought, freedom of religion, the separation between state and church, and the critical and rational reading of the Bible. It would, in essence, be a manifesto for the modern world. And it would be published, he already knew, anonymously, because putting his own name on any of that would basically be signing his own death sentence. It took 4 years to write. 4 years of revisions, cuts, rewrites, doubts, small victories in isolated chapters that finally seemed to express clearly what he had kept inside for more than a decade. And in 1670, the book was finally published in Amsterdam by a friendly editor, with a false title page, claiming to be a work edited in Hamburg by a non-existent publisher, and without an author's name. But everyone within a few weeks knew who had written it. The reaction was immediate, and it was devastating. Calvinist pastors climbed to the pulpits throughout Holland, in Germany, in England, in France. Complaints were filed with the authorities. Letters were sent to Catholic theologians asking for a position. Before long, the theological political treatise was formally banned in several European states. Copies were burned in public squares. People were arrested for possessing a copy at home. In some cities, reading the book became a crime as serious as formal heresy, with penalties of imprisonment and confiscation of property. And the more Europe banned it, the more Europe wanted to read it. The book circulated clandestinely. It was copied by hand. It was sent hidden inside barrels of goods. It was secretly translated into French, German, English. In a few years, every serious intellectual in Europe had read the book, or was trying to read it. And in all scholarly circles, the whispered name was always the same: Spinoza, Spinoza, Spinoza. The cursed name had returned, but not as a repentant prodigal son, as a threat, as a schism, as the most dangerous thought that the Christian world had faced in centuries. Bento, in Voorburg, continued polishing lenses. He read each new denunciation calmly. He read each new prohibition decree calmly. He did not respond, most of the time. When some friend despaired in a letter, "Spinoza, they are saying you are the Antichrist. Spinoza, they are burning your book in Utrecht. Spinoza, they are saying you should be arrested." "Adi," he replied, with short, serene, almost amusing phrases. In one of his most famous letters he wrote simply, "They say these things because they have not yet read me. When they read me, they will say worse." But beneath that calm, there was something he did not say in the letters, but that close people noticed. The tuberculosis, which had killed his mother and brother, was beginning to appear in him as well. The light cough at first. Then the more frequent cough. Then the growing fatigue. Then red spots on the handkerchief he kept in his pocket. He knew. He understood. He had studied enough medicine to understand, and he simply accelerated his work pace. He polished lenses in the morning. He wrote in the afternoon. He read at night, and in the small breaks he patiently attended to the visits that increasingly began to appear at his door: students, young philosophers, curious merchants, religious exiles, all wanting to meet, even for an hour, the man whose name all of Europe was forbidden to pronounce. And it was during this time, around 1673, that one of the most extraordinary scenes of his life occurred. A scene so symbolic that it seems almost fictional, but which is documented by multiple testimonies of the time. An emissary arrived in Voorburg. He was a Frenchman. He wore elegant clothes. He brought a sealed letter with the seal of the court of Versailles. He was received at the door by the landlady and asked for Mr. Bento de Spinoza. He went up to the small room upstairs. He greeted the philosopher, who received him in an apron, with hands still stained with glass dust. He sat down. He took out the letter, and he delivered to Bento a proposal coming directly from King Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, the most powerful monarch in Europe at that moment. The proposal was simple. Bento de Spinoza would receive a very generous lifetime pension from the French crown. He would receive a title. He would receive permanent residence in Paris, near the court. He would receive in essence wealth, comfort and prestige for the rest of his life, something that no other philosopher in Europe was dreaming of receiving. And in exchange for all this, he only needed to do one thing: formally dedicate his next great work to King Louis XIV. Just that, a dedication. It was a royal formal office, with a seal, with witnesses. It was an honor that could transform his life overnight. It meant leaving that cold little room in Voorburg, eating meat every day, having a library, having assistants, having everything a 17th century intellectual could want. Bento listened in silence. He looked at the letter, he looked at the emissary, and then, with that same low voice as always, without gesture, without theatre, without harshness, he replied, "Tell your king that I thank him with all my soul for the generosity he shows in offering this to a man like me. But tell your king, too, that I only dedicate my books to the truth. And the truth, unfortunately, does not belong to any throne." The emissary fell silent. He tried to argue. Bento smiled gently but did not move. The man left. The letter was collected. The pension was offered to someone else. And Bento de Spinoza's name remained from then on the list of philosophers who had refused money from a king. A very, very short list. That night, according to the account of a friend who was nearby, Bento sat at his table, opened the notebook where he was writing the Ethics, and worked in silence by the light of a single candle for another 7 consecutive hours, without fatigue, without regret, only with the serenity of someone who knows they have just paid another installment, small but real, for the freedom to continue being, until the end, the man he decided to be. The serenity of Baruch Spinoza in the face of threats, prohibitions, attempts at bribery, and theological attacks. That serenity which so impressed his contemporaries, and still impresses anyone who approaches his story today, was not, as many think, the result of a naturally cold temperament. It was not impassibility. It was not indifference. It was certainly not a lack of feeling. It was something else. It was the slow and painful result of a lifetime practicing exactly what he was writing, paragraph by paragraph, in that notebook on the table, in the cold room in Voorburg. Because the Ethics, that book he had obsessively revised for more than 10 years, was not just a treatise on philosophy. It was also, secretly, at deeper layers, a manual of spiritual survival. A manual written by a man who had been cursed, stabbed, expelled, betrayed, isolated, persecuted, and who had to discover, out of absolute necessity, a way to continue living without turning into rage, bitterness, or a desire for revenge. The Ethics began with the boldest definition that a philosophy book had ever started with. Right on the first page, even before reaching the first proposition, Spinoza defined what he understood by God. And this definition, this single definition, was, by itself, enough to make any rabbi, priest, pastor, or imam in Europe at that time declare the author as public enemy number 1 of faith. For Spinoza, God was not a father in heaven. He was not a judge. He was not a king. He was not a person. He did not have will in the human sense of the word. He did not have emotions in the human sense of the word. He did not choose favorites. He did not answer prayers. He did not perform miracles in the sense of breaking his own laws. He did not punish, did not reward, did not love as men love, did not hate as men hate. God, for Spinoza, was the infinite substance. It was the totality of what exists. It was the entire nature, not just the trees, the animals, the rivers, the stars, but everything that lies behind that, everything that sustains that, everything of which that is merely an expression. God was both the storm and the calm, life and death, what we see and what we will never see. God was, and this is Spinoza's most famous phrase, quoted thousands of times, usually without real understanding of what it means, God or nature. Deus sive natura. In Latin, 3 simple words, but 3 words that carried within them a conceptual bomb of historical proportions. Because if God is nature, all of nature, in all its infinite extent, in all its infinite modes of manifestation, then several brutal consequences follow, and these consequences, one by one, demolish the foundations of practically all organized religions of the time. First, God is not outside the world. God is the world. There is no heaven in the geographical sense. There is no beyond. There is no other place. Everything that exists is here, within the one infinite substance, and we are part of it. Every stone, every insect, every star, every thought that passes through your head at this very moment, all of this is God, not the creation of God. It is God expressing himself in this finite and particular way. Second, God has no purpose. There is no plan. There is no destiny. There is no cosmic purpose. Things do not happen to teach anything to anyone. Storms are not punishments. Healings are not miracles. Earthquakes are not warnings. Things simply happen because they follow the necessary laws of the infinite substance, laws that we can, with effort and patience, discover through reason. Third, God has no free will, nor do we. Everything that happens throughout the universe happens out of necessity. Every movement, every thought, every apparent choice is the inevitable result of prior causes. Our sense of choosing is an illusion produced by the fact that we know the effects of our actions, but ignore the deep causes of our own desires. If a stone thrown into the air had consciousness, Spinoza writes in an image that would become famous, it would believe it was flying of its own volition. We are exactly like that stone. We think we choose, but we are merely living the necessary unfolding of the forces that traverse us. And fourth, perhaps the most subversive of all, salvation does not come from obedience to a personal God, nor from the fulfillment of rituals, nor from belonging to a religious institution. Salvation comes from knowledge. It comes from understanding with reason the necessary structure of reality, and by understanding, by knowing, by comprehending, finding a deep peace that he called the intellectual love of God. It is not sentimental love. It is not devotional love. It is a type of serene affection that arises from one who finally understands that everything is part of a single eternal substance, including ourselves, and that therefore there is fundamentally nothing to fear, because there is fundamentally nothing that is truly foreign to us. All of this, written in careful Latin, organized in a geometrically impeccable deductive system, with axioms, definitions, propositions, demonstrations, and corollaries, as if it were a book of Euclid applied to the human soul, formed the heart of the ethics. And Spinoza knew, with absolute clarity, that it was exactly this heart that was unpublishable in his lifetime. That it was exactly this heart that would make the theological political treatise, although already considered a dangerous book, seem tame compared to what was to come. That is why he kept it. He rewrote it, he reorganized it. He made each sentence more precise, each proposition clearer, each demonstration more foolproof. And at the same time, in parallel in his external life, he continued polishing lenses, receiving visitors, answering letters with his usual serenity, and ignoring, with that silent elegance that was his hallmark, the increasingly frequent threats that arrived through various means. Anonymous letters, pamphlets attacking his name, formal denunciations in Protestant consistories, ecclesiastical processes being opened against anyone caught reading the treatise. It was in mid-1672 that these threats crossed for the first time from the theological plane to the physical plane, and it was at this point that the quiet life of Voorburg almost ended in tragedy. To understand what happened, we need to remember that year the whole of Holland was in convulsion. France had invaded the country from the south. England was attacking by sea. The cities were in panic. The central government, led by the brothers Johann and Cornelis de Witt, two brilliant and rationalist statesmen personally known to Spinoza, who deeply admired the philosopher and considered him almost a friend, was under internal attack by a fanatical mob that blamed the de Witts for the disastrous situation of the country and demanded the return of the Prince of Orange to power. In August of that year, tragedy exploded. An enraged mob stormed the prison in The Hague, where the de Witt brothers had been detained on false charges. And there, in broad daylight, in the very center of one of the most civilized cities in Europe, the mob dragged the two men into the street. They beat them, they stabbed them, they lynched them with a brutality that few massacres in history had ever seen. And then, this is the detail that marked all contemporaries the most. Parts of the bodies of the two brothers were cut off, sold as trophies, and some parts, according to confirmed testimonies, were cooked and devoured by the most fanatical protesters in the middle of the public square. Spinoza, in Voorburg, received the news a few hours later, through a neighbor who ran to his house to tell him what had happened. And then, according to the account of his landlord, perhaps the most moving account of Spinoza's entire life, and the only documented moment in which he lost his usual serenity, the following happened. Spinoza sat at his bench. He rested his head in his hands. For a long, long time, he remained silent. And then, with a movement that the landlord would later describe as serene but furious, he stood up. He took a piece of paper. He wrote, in firm handwriting in Latin, two words, Ultimi Barbarorum. In Portuguese, Last of the Barbarians. He took the paper, he put on his coat, and he began to walk toward the door, determined to go out, cross Voorburg, traverse the paths to The Hague, and go personally to the site of the lynching, to paste that poster with his own eyes against the nearest wall, right in the middle of the crowd that was still celebrating the massacre. He would have been killed, without a doubt. In that climate, at that moment, with that crowd still in bloody delirium, anyone who appeared with a poster calling the protesters barbarians would be torn apart in seconds. But the landlord, a simple man, a merchant, without academic education, but with the practical intelligence of someone who truly loves the people he lives with, did something that perhaps saved, at that moment, all of Western philosophy. He stepped in front of the door, he locked it. He took the key. He looked at Spinoza, who was still holding the paper, and said with tears in his eyes, "Mr. Spinoza, I know how you feel. I feel it too. But if you go out that door now with that paper in hand, you will die before nightfall. And I cannot allow that. You can hit me. You can curse me. You can say whatever you want. But today you are not leaving this house. Today I will not let you die." Spinoza stood still, in silence, for long minutes. Then, without saying anything, he turned around. He walked back to his table. He sat down. He placed the paper on the wood. And there, with his head down, he cried. He cried like no one had ever seen him cry before. He cried for the de Witts, for his friends, for reason attacked in the streets, for the barbarism that had triumphed over the civilization he so longed to see flourish. He cried in silence, without sobs, without screams, just the tears slowly streaming down his ever-dark coat. It was the only moment in all his adult life when someone saw Baruch Spinoza cry. That night, he burned the poster in the fireplace. He never wrote or mentioned in any surviving letter the name of the de Witts. It was too painful, but also, and this may be even more important, because he understood at that moment, amid the purest pain he had felt in years, one thing that would make him continue, from then on, to write the ethics with renewed urgency. He understood that those ideas he was putting on paper, that understanding that reason is the only thing that can save humanity from its own violence, were not an academic luxury. They were not a joke. They were not idle speculation. They were, literally, the only possible vaccine against the poison he had just seen explode in the streets of The Hague. If reason does not prevail, Spinoza wrote in a letter roughly from that time, then humanity will still have many, many massacres ahead. And we, all of us, will always be, like those men in the square, the last of the barbarians. He returned to polishing lenses the next morning. He returned to writing the following night. And his silence, from then on, became even deeper, but it was a different silence. It was the silence of a man who had finally understood that it was not enough to think the truth. It was necessary at all costs to finish writing it before the body, already tired, already coughing more and more, already marked by the disease that had killed his family, finally gave up being a body. And time, he was already feeling, was becoming short. In 1670, in the same year that the theological political treatise was secretly published, Baruch Spinoza left Voorburg and moved to The Hague. It was a discreet move, like all the changes in his life. He rented a modest room on the upper floor of a painter named Hendrik van der Spik on Pavilionsgracht Street. He brought the same trunks as always, his father's bed, the polishing instruments, the notebooks, and that dark coat with the old tear sewn inside, which continued to be his second skin, his only constant companion, his silent witness. The room was small. It had a window facing a canal, a narrow bed, a desk, a workbench, 2 stools, a low shelf where books were neatly piled. It was there that he would live the last 7 years of his life. It was there that he would finish writing the Ethics. And it was there, in that very room, that he would die. The Van der Spik house was a simple, warm home full of children. Hendrik was a friendly man, religious in his own way, a practicing Calvinist, but without fanaticism. His wife, Margarita, was a practical, generous woman who cooked well and took care of Spinoza as she would any other family member. The couple's young children often climbed up to the philosopher's room to ask questions, show drawings, tell stories. And Spinoza, this same Spinoza who had been excommunicated, hunted, persecuted throughout Europe, welcomed the children with a patient smile, and more than once was seen helping them spell words or drawing, with pen and ink, small figures on pieces of paper to entertain them. One of the most moving accounts from that time comes precisely from Mrs. Van der Spik. Years later, when asked by a biographer about what it was like to live with that strange man whom the pastors spoke so ill of, she replied, with that simple sincerity of common women, "Mr. Spinoza was the best person I ever met in my life. He spoke ill of no one. He asked for nothing. He complained about nothing. When my children made noise, he just smiled. When my husband was worried about money, he offered the little he had. And when I fell ill, he would come up to my room with hot tea and ask if I wanted him to read something aloud. I do not know what he believed about God, but I know what he did, and what he did was better than any sermon I ever heard in church." It was in this environment, humble, calm, domestic, that he continued working on the Ethics. In parallel, his fame grew silently throughout Europe. More and more visitors began to appear at the door of Pavilionsgracht. German students made weeks-long trips just to spend an afternoon with him. English merchants diverted their routes to meet him. Young French philosophers, who had secretly read the treatise, crossed borders to sit in his room and listen, for a few hours, to the soft voice of the man who had challenged the entire world with a serenity that no one understood. And in 1673, one of the most extraordinary offers of his entire life reached Spinoza. It came from the University of Heidelberg. It was a formal letter sealed with the seal of the Elector Prince of the Palatinate. The university officially offered Spinoza the chair of philosophy, generous salary, housing, permanent residence in Heidelberg. Freedom, so said the letter, to teach whatever he wanted. Just one single caveat, carefully written in the last lines of the document, that he not abuse this freedom to disturb the established public religion. Spinoza read, reread. He replied 3 days later with that serene politeness that was his hallmark. He thanked, he acknowledged the honor, and he declined, for one single reason. That final phrase, that he not disturb the established public religion, meant for him that the offered freedom was not freedom. It was a cage with golden bars. It was the same type of offer that the synagogue had made when he was 22. Money in exchange for silence, a position in exchange for obedience, prestige in exchange for hypocrisy. And he had learned 17 years earlier in Amsterdam that this was not a trade. It was a slow death. In his letter of refusal, a single line survived that became famous. I do not know within what limits this philosophical freedom should be confined, so that I do not seem to wish to disturb the established public religion. For schisms do not arise so much from a burning love for religion as from the diverse passions of men. In other words, I prefer to continue polishing lenses, thank you. And that is exactly what he did. He returned to the bench. He returned to the glass. He returned to the small room on Pavilionsgracht, and he continued writing in silence the only thing that mattered, the book that would, after his death, change the world. In November 1676, a carriage stopped in front of the Van der Spijk house. A young man got out, short, with a powdered French-style wig, dressed in an expensive dark fabric coat, elegant shoes, and a simultaneously curious and cautious expression on his face. He was 30 years old. He was considered, in the intellectual Europe of the time, one of the brightest minds of his generation. He was a mathematician, philosopher, diplomat, logician, inventor, jurist. He was a personal friend of kings. He was invited to courts. He had been praised by Newton and would soon begin to argue with Newton over who invented calculus, one of the most famous scientific disputes in history. His name was Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, and he was there to meet Spinoza. The visit had been carefully prepared for months. Leibniz was a cautious man. He knew that being seen entering Spinoza's house could destroy his career, as the name of the cursed philosopher was still, that year, one of the most dangerous things an intellectual in Europe could have associated with himself. But his curiosity was stronger than his fear. He had secretly read the theological political treatise. He had read letters exchanged with mutual friends. He had heard rumors about an unfinished book called Ethics that circulated in manuscript fragments among the restricted circles of Europe. And he needed to see with his own eyes the man who had written all of that. The meeting lasted several hours. It took place in that same small room upstairs. There is no detailed account of the conversation. Leibniz, years later, would say very little about that meeting, and for a very clear reason, because publicly admitting to having been with Spinoza would have been reputational suicide. But some of his private notes, discovered centuries later, leave valuable clues. Leibniz sat on the stool in front of Spinoza. They spoke in Latin. They discussed metaphysics, theology, politics. They discussed the nature of God, the structure of substance, the relationship between mind and body. They discussed the European turmoil, wars, religious persecutions. And at one point, according to the notes, Spinoza, who was already visibly ill, paler, thinner, coughing more frequently, opened a drawer of his desk, took out a bundle of handwritten pages, and showed Leibniz, for the very first time, some fragments of the Ethics. Leibniz remained silent. He read slowly, page by page, without commenting, without asking questions, just reading. For a time that seemed, according to his own notes, an eternity. When he returned the pages to Spinoza, he was shaken. He would later note, privately, that that afternoon was one of the most disturbing of my life, because he had understood with the brutal clarity that only true philosophers can have, that that book, if ever published, would change the course of Western thought forever. But he had also understood another, more painful thing, that his own name, if associated with it, would never survive the public condemnation that would follow. Leibniz said goodbye to Spinoza at the threshold of the door. He shook his hand, and he left. For the rest of his life in public, Leibniz would pretend he had never met Spinoza. He would deny the contacts. He would minimize the admiration. He would attack, in later writings, several of Spinoza's ideas. He would attack forcefully, with argumentative violence, as if trying to erase from his own thought any suspicion of contagion. But in private letters, he would reveal here and there the truth. And that truth is that he left that afternoon knowing, with the cold certainty of one who understands things he cannot say, that he had been in the presence of one of the most radical and clearest thinkers humanity had ever produced. Spinoza remained in the room. He put the manuscripts back in the drawer. He locked it. He sat down at the bench. He took a lens that was in an intermediate stage of polishing, and he returned to work, with the same serenity as always, as if that extraordinary visit had never happened. For him, deep down, it did not really matter who entered or left his room. What mattered was the only thing that had always mattered: to finish the book. Before the body gave up. And the body, he now knew, was very close to giving up. The winter of 1676 to 1677 was harsh in The Hague. The cold seeped through the cracks in the windows. The canal in front of the house froze on some nights, and in the small room on the upper floor of Paviljoensgracht, Bento de Espinosa, almost 44 years old, finally felt the weight of a lifetime breathing the fine dust of polished glass. Every lens he had produced, and there had been thousands over 2 decades, had left in the air of his little room an invisible, microscopic, but relentless dust. This dust had entered his lungs every day, and combined with a family predisposition to tuberculosis, the same disease that had killed his mother, his brother, and who knows how many others before them, it had produced the clinical picture that now manifested without disguise. The cough was constant, the handkerchief stained with blood, the skin almost translucent, the hands thinner each week, and the fatigue, a deep, persistent fatigue that did not pass with sleep, settled within his body like a permanent tenant. Bento did not complain. He continued working, polishing fewer lenses, it is true, because his fingers no longer had the same steadiness, but writing more, writing with an urgency he himself recognized. Years later, in a letter that survived from that period, he would admit to a friend with a touching simplicity, "I do not know how much time I have left, but I know that I still need to correct 3 parts of the ethics. If I do not finish, someone will have to finish for me. And I prefer, if possible, to finish it myself." And that is exactly what he did. In those final months, he finished. He finished the part on human nature. He finished the part on the servitude of passions. He finished the part on freedom, which was the 5th and final part of the book, and which may be, of the 5, the most mysterious and the most beautiful. It was in this 5th part that he developed, in serene propositions and geometric demonstrations, the idea he had kept within himself for more than 20 years, the idea that there exists a type of human knowledge, he called it the 3rd kind, capable of making a human being. Upon finally understanding their own position within the infinite substance, find what he called beatitude, not happiness in the common sense, not pleasure, but a form of absolute peace, a form of silent joy that arises from one who understands at the deepest possible level that they are at home in the universe, that they are part of it, that they always have been part of it, and that they always will be. He wrote, in this last part, one of the most moving sentences in all of Western philosophy. The human mind, wrote Bento, cannot be absolutely destroyed with the body, but something of it remains that is eternal, not in the sense of a personal soul that flies to heaven, not in the traditional Christian sense, but in the sense that every piece of true understanding we achieve in life becomes, in some way, a permanent part of the eternal structure of the infinite substance. The truths you comprehend do not die with you. They remain, in some way, as an eternal expression of the real, and more. He also wrote the sentence that perhaps best summarizes the serenity of his own life. The free man thinks of nothing less than of death, and his wisdom is a meditation on life, not on death. When the landlord, Hendrik van der Spijk, read this sentence many years later, and Hendrik was not a man of philosophy, he was a simple painter, he would have said, with tears in his eyes, that this sentence described exactly the man he had lived with for 7 years. He never spoke of death, said Hendrik. Never, not even when he was coughing blood, not even when he lost sleep, not even when the doctors had already given up. He only spoke of what still needed to be finished. The last months were silent. He received few visits. He answered few letters. He worked slowly, but with an obstinate consistency, on the final revision of the manuscript. He ate little, bread, milk, eggs when available, hot soups that Mrs. van der Spijk insisted on preparing for him, and in February 1677 the end approached. February 20th, 1677 dawned cold in The Hague. It was a Saturday. The van der Spijks had agreed, early in the morning, to go together to the service of the Reformed Church. Before they left, Mrs. van der Spijk went up to Bento's room to ask if he wanted anything. She found him sitting at the counter, dressed in his usual dark coat, his hair tied back, breathing short, but with an intact smile. "Can I prepare something before leaving, Mr. Spinoza?" Bento thanked her. He asked for a small chicken broth. He said he was hungry. Margaretha went downstairs, prepared the broth, and brought it to the room in a small bowl. Bento thanked her again. He drank in silence, slowly. He said while she waited, "It's very good, thank you." She asked if he wanted someone to stay with him. He said no. He said he was fine, that he would rest a little. He told them to go to church peacefully. Before she left, he asked just one thing, to ask the doctor, Dr. Lodewijk Meyer, an old friend, part of the intellectual circle of Amsterdam, to visit him when they returned. He had something to discuss with him. The family left, the footsteps in the hallway, the door closing, the silence entering the house, and Bento, alone, finished drinking the broth. He wiped his lips with the handkerchief. He looked out the window at the frozen canal, at the grey sky, at the pale light of that winter Saturday. He looked at the manuscripts on the table, the ethics finally completed, the letters in order, the papers stacked as he wanted. He looked at the torn coat, at the polishing instruments, at the books on the shelves. He looked, according to the account, that would later reconstruct the scene, with a serenity that seemed, finally, the serenity of someone who saw their work done to the end. Then he turned in the chair. He leaned on the counter. He took a deep breath, once, twice, 3 times, and when Dr. Meyer arrived at the house that same afternoon, alerted by the family returning from church, he found Bento de Spinoza fallen on the narrow bed of the little room, his eyes open, his face calm, his breath interrupted. He had died alone, at 44 years old, without a rabbi, without a priest, without family, without any friend by his side, only with the torn coat, the manuscripts of the ethics on the table, and the old blanket of his father covering his feet. The news spread through the city in a few hours. Neighbors came to the house, stopped in front of the door, quietly asking if it was true. Letters began to be dispatched to Amsterdam, to Leiden, to Utrecht, to London, to Paris, to all points in Europe where someone needed to know that the cursed philosopher had finally departed. Hendrik van der Spik, with the help of Dr. Meyer and close friends, organized the funeral in silence. Bento was buried on February 25, 1677, in the Nieuwe Kerk Church in The Hague. Yes, a Christian church, because the synagogue would never accept the body of an excommunicated person, and because he himself had never requested to be buried according to any specific religious rite. It was the only possible solution. It was also, perhaps, the most symbolic. That man who had been rejected by the Jews, attacked by Christians, condemned by all organized religions of his time, ended up buried in neutral ground, without formal ceremony, without sectarian prayers, as if the very geography of his death responded, in its own way, to the philosophical question he had spent his life trying to answer. Truth does not belong to any institution. The tombstone was simple. It had only the name, the date, and a single word in Latin, caut, which means care or be cautious. It was the word he had engraved on his personal ring, and which had been the silent motto of his entire adult life. Be cautious, not with fear, with truth. After the burial, the friends returned to the house. They went up to the philosopher's room. They found the Ethics on the table, complete, in order, ready to be published. They found, beside it, handwritten instructions on how the book should be edited, on which letters should be included, on which should not. They found the dark coat hanging on the wall. They found the father's bed, with the old blanket folded at the feet. And in silence, with tears in their eyes, they understood that this, in that silent little room, was the legacy that this man left to the world. A bed, a coat, some lenses, and a book. But what a book! The Ethics was published in Latin in December 1677, 10 months after the death of Bento de Spinoza, along with some of his letters and 3 minor treatises. It was a small volume, clandestinely edited in Amsterdam by his closest friends. It did not bear the author's name on the cover. It only bore the initials, BDS, Benedictus de Spinoza. The reaction, in almost all of Europe, was one of horror. In the first months after publication, the book was banned by dozens of jurisdictions. It was attacked by priests, pastors, rabbis, university professors, in sermons, in pamphlets, in refutation books. The name of Spinoza became synonymous with atheism, although what he had written was not in any sense atheism, but one of the deepest philosophical theologies ever produced. But at that moment, no one read carefully, no one wanted to understand. People only wanted to condemn, and they condemned. For the next 100 years, being a Spinozist became a serious accusation. Philosophers were prosecuted if they confessed any sympathy. Books were burned if they quoted any passage. Entire European universities adopted, as official policy, the obligation for their professors to publicly refute Spinoza before they could assume any position. It was perhaps the largest organized intellectual hunt in modern Europe against a single thinker, and yet the book circulated. In secret, hand-copied, translated in hiding, read by candlelight, in locked rooms, by men and women who could not publicly admit ever that they had read it. It was the most dangerous book in Europe, and precisely for that reason, it was also the most sought after. And little by little, over a century, something began to change. Around 1780 in Germany, a small group of young romantic philosophers began to rediscover Spinoza. Goethe, yes, the Goethe, read the Ethics with the feeling of finally finding the philosophical expression of everything he intuited about nature, about life, about the cosmos. Years later, he would openly declare without fear, "Spinoza did not show me the passion for nature. He showed me that nature was God. Schelling, Hegel, Schleiermacher, all the great philosophers of German idealism, would begin to openly cite Spinoza. Hegel would say the immortal phrase, either you are a Spinozist or you are not a philosopher. In the 19th century, Schopenhauer would discover Spinoza and classify him among the 3 or 4 greatest thinkers of all time. Nietzsche later would write to Franz Overbeck on a postcard, one of the most moving declarations in philosophy, "I have a precursor, and what a precursor." He was talking about Spinoza, and when the 20th century arrived, something extraordinary happened. Modern physicists, those who were discovering the theory of relativity, quantum mechanics, the deep structures of matter, began to find themselves, without having sought it, in dialogue with that little book polished in Latin by a man who lived in a cold room in The Hague, and the name of Albert Einstein enters history. When, in 1929, an American rabbi sent a telegram to Einstein asking if he believed in God, Einstein replied in a sentence that would go around the world, translated into all languages, quoted in millions of books for the next 100 years. "I believe in the God of Spinoza, who reveals himself in the orderly harmony of all that exists, and not in a God who concerns himself with the destinies and actions of human beings." At that moment, at that exact moment, the man who had been cursed in July 1656 in a synagogue in Amsterdam, in the presence of 7 candles and 7 men, returned definitively to the center of history. He returned through the mouth of the greatest scientist of the 20th century. He returned through the science he had predicted. He returned through the reason he had defended alone against the barbarism of an entire Europe. And he returned to never leave again. Today, in the 21st century, the name of Baruch Spinoza is in all serious universities in the world. His works are translated into all the languages spoken by humanity. His philosophy is studied in departments of philosophy, theology, physics, psychology, neuroscience, political science. In Amsterdam, the Portuguese synagogue, where he was excommunicated in 1656, still exists, and today, in the museum attached to it, there is a permanent exhibition about Spinoza, where visitors can read, in silence, under golden light, the full text of the herem that tried to erase him forever. The Esnoga has never revoked the herem. For centuries, the community discussed whether it should do so. In 2012, a group of philosophers formally requested the Portuguese Jewish community of Amsterdam to consider officially annulling the excommunication. The community gathered, discussed for months, and decided, based on rabbinical opinions, to maintain the herem in effect, not out of hatred, not out of revenge, but because, according to the official justification, Spinoza had never asked to be readmitted, and because it would be, according to tradition, inappropriate to annul a herem in the name of someone who had never shown a desire to return. And deep down, perhaps this decision is the most philosophically Spinozist of all, because Spinoza, throughout his life, never asked to return. He never complained about the expulsion. He never wrote a single line asking for repentance or reconciliation. He did not need to. The truth he had within him was greater than any community, and he walked, with the calm of one who knows, to the end of his own life, carrying this truth like a man carries an invisible cross through the narrow streets of the world, without ever putting it down. And now, at the end of this story, I need to tell you one thing. This video that you just watched is not just about a man who lived almost 400 years ago. It is not just about a Dutch philosopher of Portuguese descent. It is not just about a curse in a synagogue, about a knife in the back, about polished lenses in cold rooms, about books burned in public squares. It is about you. It is about every time you have felt, within you, a truth that no one around you was prepared to hear, and you swallowed it. It is about every time you preferred to stay quiet instead of saying what you thought, because you knew it would cost you friends, family, community. It's about every time the world offered you comfort in exchange for silence, and you hesitated because a part of you wanted to accept, and another part of you, a deeper, older, more stubborn part, knew that accepting would be to start dying inside. Spinoza is about that part of you, about the part that still asks, the part that still wants to understand, the part that still, amidst a noisy, distracted society satisfied with ready answers, dares to stop, sit in silence and say to itself, "Wait a minute, I need to think this through before accepting." He carried that part alone. He carried it against the synagogue, against the church, against kings, against philosophers, against his own family. He carried it sick, poor, betrayed, forgotten, and yet against absolutely everything he did not give up. He did not sell out. He did not back down. He polished lenses during the day, wrote at night, and died alone in a cold little room in The Hague, with his father's blanket at his feet and the ethics finished on the table. And today, 349 years after that winter morning when he had his last chicken broth, he won. He won not because he was recognized, not because he was rehabilitated, not because the rabbis reversed their decision, but because his thought that so many tried to kill, is alive within every person who at this very moment around the world dares to ask a true question of themselves, including within you now, here, watching this video. The cross he carried so that you today would not have to carry it alone, because every time you think for yourself, every time you refuse to swallow an easy answer, every time you place the truth a millimeter above comfort, you are unknowingly helping him carry that invisible cross one more step forward in the history of humanity. And this is the only form of tribute he would ever have accepted. No statues, no prayers, no ceremonies, just keep thinking, keep asking, keep, against the whole world, being the man or woman you decided to be. Because the man who carried the cross almost disappeared from history, almost. But he did not disappear. And as long as there is, somewhere in the world, a person willing to stop, take a deep breath, and think calmly about what is truly true, he will never disappear. Thank you for staying until the end.